Have you ever wanted to get inside the inner workings of high-profile criminal cases? True Crime and Human Design explores thrilling stories that reevaluate themes through an energetic lens. What new details and pockets of understanding might we see when we apply a human design filter to some of life's darkest corners? I'm your host, Corrine Araujo, and this is True Crime and Human Design.
Hello, loves. I am so excited. This was a complete just, I wonder if I should shoot my shot type of thing. And I did. And the very next morning, I was graced with a response from Karen Conti. And I would love for you, Karen, to just take the platform and share who you are and what you do in your experience and really who we're going to be speaking about.
Thank you, Corrine, and thanks for having me. I've been a lawyer for about 37 years in Chicago. And I just recently wrote a book that was published in March called Killing Time with John Wayne Gacy, Defending America's Most Evil Serial Killer on Death Row. Back in approximately May 10th, 1994, Gacy was executed for killing 33 young men and boys and burying most of them under his house. During his crime spree, I was in high school. So, I had 14 years after he was incarcerated and given the death penalty. I was now a lawyer and I got called upon to represent Gacy. So, for many years after his execution, I didn't write my book. I wanted to, but I just didn't get around to doing it. COVID happened and I was spending more time at home, like a lot of people in this world. And I was able to sit down and finally write my story about what it was like spend 7 months visiting, at the time, the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States, and what it was like to spend over 50 hours with him, daily phone conversations, many in-person conversations, and what it was like to try to connect with him and try to save his life.
Wow. So mentioned save his life. Could you go into that a little bit more in regards to the death penalty and really what drew you into that?
Sure. I think you have to go back to my opinion on the death penalty. Even when I was a young child, I was against the death penalty under any circumstances, and my parents were in favor. I don't know where I came up with the idea that the death penalty was wrong, but I've always believed it was wrong. I never in a million years ever imagined that I'd ever handle a death penalty case, let alone a death penalty case for the most prolific serial killer. But just by a fluke, I got called upon by Gacy to come down and visit him on death row. He wanted my partner and I to represent him in some civil matters that he had, which was ridiculous because he had a death date set. And this was, of course, obviously very important because he were unsuccessful, he was going to be executed. So just out of curiosity, and because I was always against the death penalty, and because I was always really fascinated by serial killers. I was one of those people, like many of your listeners. I knew everything about Jack the Ripper. I knew everything about Lizzie Borden and all of those famous killers. And I wanted to look evil in the eyes. So I ended up visiting John Wayne Gacy. And at that point, I decided I wanted to take his death row appeal and try to save his life. We weren't trying to get him out of prison. It was really just to stop the execution from happening.
I bet from there you had no idea of what you were about to enter into.
If I only knew, right?
Oh, so let's go into that because I think what's really important is we do gather a greater understanding of John Wayne Gacy because a lot of us are biased. We have our opinions and we like to make them facts. And then the documentaries often tend to be a little bit biased depending on who's creating it, where the source comes from. But I just want to know so much more because I feel like no matter how far I've dug into Gacy, it's been really challenging to gain a greater awareness of his circumstances throughout his childhood. There's very vague reports out there, but it just I know there is more. I know, of course, with so many people, there's so much more. But with him, I just keep meeting these barriers of just what was his life like? Or what did he account his life to be like? How did he feel about his life in regards to how he communicated it to you and your understanding?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of conflicting report of who Gacy was, and I read things all the time on a weekly basis, and it's amazing how different these facts are. And I sat with him and talked to him, and now he wasn't always truthful about everything, but I think I did get to the bottom a little bit of what he was like. So back in the day, back in the 1940s and 50s, when Gacy was growing up, he lived in a very traditional lifestyle back then. This was a different time and place. He was raised in a blue collar neighborhood in Chicago. Father was very abusive. He was named John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne was that famous macho cowboy. And Gacy was born and he was never really a macho guy. He didn't like sports. He didn't like hunting and fishing like his dad wanted him to. And he liked gardening and he liked cooking and things that were more female oriented. His mother was very passive. His father was abusive and was very critical of him and would call him horrible names that were derogatory as to his sexuality. His father beat him. Father would take him down in the basement and beat him when he was drunk. And his two sisters, whom he loved dearly, he got along with very well, but they were spared this criticism from the father. Really focused on him all the time when it came to being critical. There's a bunch of things. He was raised in a very Catholic home, and here he was, probably knowing at some point that he was either bisexual or homosexual, and it was very confusing for him. And back in those days, many of your younger listeners have, don't remember that those were the days where you could not come out. You got married regardless of what your homosexuality was. This was not something that was acceptable in society. So he was very compromised when it came to that. Two other things that I think are important to talk about, and that is he had two episodes of being sexually abused during his young childhood. One of them was just a neighbor or a friend of his father's who took him on drives and would touch him inappropriately. And then there was actually a woman, she was a young adult, who sexually abused him in a home near his house. And this was when he was very young, maybe 8 years old. So he wasn't even old enough to really understand what was going on. So those two experiences, I think, could have traumatized him in a way, as many people are traumatized by sexual abuse when they're young. Again, all of those things that factor in don't actually explain why he killed 33 young men and boys. But those are factors that I think could have contributed to what he became.
Hmm. Absolutely. With all of the digging I've done, and I've read forensic evaluation after forensic evaluation, or people rewriting a forensic evaluation based on their studies, I have never found the sexual abuse factor. And I think that's where, too, intuitively, I was like, of course, there are so many pieces missing. We can't get the whole picture all the time. But there was something so prominent missing, and I knew that. And it just makes, in addition to the abuse for his homosexuality from his father, especially being the only boy and feeling like you were the only child that was experiencing this more or less. So his sisters were not experiencing it or to the extent of what he was whatsoever. So that's a whole nother like shame, blame, guilt, all of the fun feelings on top of it for him. Like, why
Right.
me?
And you're right. And it probably exacerbated his bad experiences to see that his father wasn't doing it to all the kids, just him. And he really focused all of his anger and his hatred on John Gacy. And that's hard because throughout the time that I spoke with him about his father, he vacillated between telling me he really loved his father to telling me he was a bastard and he was horrible to him. But you could just feel and sense that he wanted to make his dad proud, that he wanted to be successful in life, which he was. He was a construction owner of a construction company that was very successful. And to today's dollars, he probably was making over $500,000 a year. And so he was married, he had children, he lived in a nice house, he volunteered in hospitals, he went to church every Sunday, he got involved in politics. So he did all of these things with the idea of making his father proud of him. And I think that really motivated him to, quote, succeed on one hand, and then on the other hand, doing these horrible things at night that were more horrific than anything you can imagine. You have to think about what he was doing when he was committing these crimes and why he was committing these crimes. And again, if you read the psychiatry reports, there are a number of factors as to what actually was going on.
Did he discuss these crimes with you? Because I know, of course, when we have such high profile cases, I tell people all the time, you have to expect that the baseline, they're going to manipulate you, right? Their baseline is manipulating and lying. They've learned this tactic, they've learned this tool and this defense mechanism of manipulation and lying in order to ultimately protect themselves. If you can move past the fact that they're going to manipulate you at some point in some way and just use your critical thinking and problem solving to really pick up the pieces and the little gems they're dropping, then you're going to be able to paint a fuller picture that maybe they weren't intending you to see. But yeah, did he sometimes some high profile cases will over exaggerate their number or under exaggerate or claim innocence and really switch back and forth depending on how they feel it's going to benefit their case in the moment. And did you experience that with him? Any inconsistencies or what did he confess them to you?
When Gacy was arrested, we finally caught. And I think, as an aside, I think he was wrapping up at this point, as many serial killers do, and they almost want to get caught.
Yep.
And they start taking risks because it just becomes way too much stress on them. Not to say that he was remorseful, it was just that he couldn't handle it anymore because he needed more and more to fuel his purges. When he was arrested, he confessed to his lawyer and the police, and he was amazing in almost a photographic memory of where he picked up each young man or boy, what he did, some names, what souvenirs were in the house, and where he buried them under his crawl space. And he actually drew a map as to where all these young men and boys were buried. So he fully confessed. However, he stopped confessing at some point. So by the time that I got to know him, he was like, no, I didn't murder anyone except the first one. And that wasn't murder, it was self defense. So he was lying. As you said, he was a manipulator, he was a liar. And you're so right. When you are an antisocial personality, everybody around you is a pawn. The only reason that you are socializing with anyone is to use all of those pawns to get what they want. And it's instinctive. They don't even think about it. Like you or I would have to go, I know Karen, she's going to help me do this and I'm going to manipulate her. No, it's instinctive. So Gacy would gather and garner information from people. Where did you grow up? What are you thinking about? How was your relationship with your father? He would ask you questions, not because he was interested or being social. He was doing it so he could use those facts to get what he wanted, whether it was to make you feel guilt, maybe it was to make fun of you and push you to do something that you didn't want to do, or even just disarm you a little bit so that you were a little unsure of yourself. But I knew that about Gacy. I knew because I read about the psychology. So I knew that's what he was going to do. And in so doing, I could manipulate him back.
Yeah.
But he was one day he'd say one thing, one day he'd say another, one day he'd say, I think everybody should be able to have sex with whomever they want. Homosexuality is fine. Then the next day I talked to him, he'd say, oh, those homosexuals are a bunch of what? So every day, there was no consistency in who he was. He was a shallow shell of a person who said whatever he wanted to get what he wanted.
Mm. Which is so much of what we see overall. I wonder too, To that extent, a lot of times what we see when we see these manipulation tactics and he's saying one thing and then saying something else the next day, it's because that's the conflict that's going on deep within him. He's really struggling. And as we know, or as we can gather, being a homosexual during that time period, especially like you pointed out, with his father and the abuse because of it, was a complete and total battle for him. That is a major factor that goes into why he did what he did. And so I think it's so interesting to especially pointing that out, that he definitely was subconsciously trying to rationalize or cope with the situation, and he just didn't know how to. He couldn't
Well,
come to terms.
oh, exactly. And and I'm speculating, but my speculations are based upon what I've read, the various reports that were done during the trial period where he was examined by a number of psychiatrists. And the idea was that he wanted control over these young men and boys, which is a very common motivation with serial killers. They want to dominate, they want to bind them, they want to torture them, they want to be in control because Gacy was not in control when he was a young boy. He had no control when his father was doing what he was doing and beating him. And interestingly, his father beat him in the basement. So maybe that's why he
Yes.
really makes a lot of sense. And the other thing is, he hated those boys. He hated them, and he was hating himself by killing them. So many of these young men and boys were homosexuals or they were prostitutes, not all of them, not all of them. But the idea was that he was killing himself over and over again because he hated who he was. And that to me makes total sense.
Complete and total sense. And it's one of these things and these ideas of, I couldn't have that, so you can't have that. It's not fair that you get to live out your life being gay or openly gay or somewhat openly gay and engaging in this aspect, right? And I can't. It's not fair. So a lot of times we see that motivation too of, this was taken from me. I need to take it back. And that's where that power and control really comes into play. And that's where like childhood abuse is so dangerous, because we have to look at the ways, I really consider them soul losses, is that every time a child is abused, a part of their soul is like being picked away. And then by the time maybe intervention gets to them, they have big gaping holes all over them that they're looking to fill with something. Well, what was taken with them? How was it taken? And a lot of times that's where we see the acts come back up.
And think about Gacy, okay? He's looking at this young man who all of his victims were same type. They were shorter, they were smaller victims, and he was attracted to them sexually. Okay, so he's attracted to them. That was his deal. But he so hated the fact that he was attracted to them that he hated them and he hated himself for hating them, for being attracted to them. And I just think that he couldn't just have sex with them. He had to kill them. He had to torture them. He had to make it hurt the way he hurt. And they always say, hurt people. And again, I don't by any means, I'm trying to say, if you were sexually abused, you're going to turn into a John Wayne Gacy, because there are a lot of people out there who have suffered abuse from family members and have been raped and have not turned out to be the monster that Gacy became. But you can understand it, can't you? Depending on how sensitive he was and the times and the particular brand of evil that was perpetrated on him, you can kind of understand it.
Mhm. When we experience abuse at any level, a sense of normalcy is completely gone. So recently I was talking to someone about my podcast and they were like, okay, I get it. I understand what you're saying. If I experience this, I want to go out and just kill someone. And I said, that's because you have privilege somewhere that person did not. You have a support system somewhere that person did not. And we have to understand that is great that you're able to say that, because you're in a space where you're seeking connection. Your nervous system wants to be connected. Our nervous systems latch on to one another, and that's how co-regulation occurs. So your nervous system, because of your environment, because of your experiences, because of your situation, right now you feel safe. You feel able and motivated to connect with someone else. Someone that's experienced, especially significant chronic abuse, their nervous system is doing something completely opposite. I look at it as a lighthouse at the top of their head. Their nervous system is scanning the room for perceived threats or danger. And it still wants to latch. We want to connect. So it's latching to people. And when you're a dysregulated nervous system, chances are you're latching onto a dysregulated nervous system in return, or a nervous system that maybe you can control, that you can dysregulate. So, yeah, I just think it's important for people to understand that if you can consciously say to me, that wouldn't make me want to do that, you also have to recognize that you are in a space where you feel safe and protected for that moment and you want to connect. But when we are in a space where we're perceiving danger, what do you want to, like, say we were out walking the street and someone starts following us? Do you want to connect with the person that's following you? Or do you want to run? Or do you want to hide? Or do you want to pick up your phone? Do you want to grab your keys to protect yourself? The goal is protection when we're in a survival state. And with consistent childhood traumatic events, that becomes embedded and regular for our nervous system. So that's more or less becomes his baseline.
It's his comfort zone in a way, and because that's what he knew growing up. And I think there's another layer to it from what I have read, which is these people who do these kinds of things, and a lot of them are sexual in nature, is that they're somehow connecting violence with sex, because for normal people, those two things are so mutually exclusive that you can't even imagine them being tied together in any way. Whereas Gacy couldn't really perform unless he was hurting somebody. So this fantasy that he had may have started out with just homosexual sex or sex with younger young men or boys. And then it had to escalate. It had to be torture. And then you had to kill him because you needed more and more. And those fantasies took over. I imagine that there are people out there who may have fantasies that are not very pleasant, but they have some semblance of control, some kind of regulation, whatever it is, support system, they want to stay in society, they have the wherewithal to stop those things from going into action. But with Gacy, he took a lot of drugs, he was on a lot of drinking a lot of alcohol, he didn't have a support system, he kept all this stuff secret, and he did it by himself. So I think that combination also allowed him to do these things in a way that maybe others just didn't go there.
Mm. So I am very interested to hear too about really, like, you said 7 months, correct? That
Yes.
you were with him. Now, how did you feel during those times with him? Because I can imagine, especially you were 29, correct?
Yes.
You were 29, it's this major case. There has to be a lot of feelings flying around, and you have to interpret a lot of different messages that are being shared, not only from him, but you have to process the ones from the external world as well.
I have to tell you, I'm a very empathetic person. I think that makes me a good lawyer because I don't care what somebody did, whether I represented companies that manufacture asbestos that kill people. I've represented people who are guilty of domestic violence, people who embezzle money from their church. You name the bad act, I've represented somebody somewhere along the line. So I don't judge them. I just do my job, and I don't do justice. If I do my job and everybody else in the process, the judge and the jury and the other lawyer and the police, and if everyone does their job, justice is usually done. Okay. So I looked at Gacy and I thought, I don't have to like him. I don't really have to understand him, but I'm curious about him. So I am going to try to get to know him because I'm very curious. But I will tell you that it was very interesting that even though Gacy did some of the most inhumane things that things I couldn't even imagine, That was the things that Gacy did were not humane. But the rest of him was humane. He lived a life where he loved his sister and his mother. He loved his family. He loved his 2 wives, got along with them. He had a lot of respect for his church. He was a hard worker, so he had all of these good qualities. And then at night, he would go out and do these things that are horrific. I liked the part of Gacy that was normal. He was human in a certain way. I'm not saying I wanted him out. I'm not saying he was my bestie, but he was a human being. And I would never stoop to the level of a Gacy in the world to say, I want you dead because you committed crimes on other people. I'd say throw him in jail, never let him walk among us because he's dangerous, the predator. But I found humanity in him. I found humanity in his family. His family loved him. He had neighbors and friends showed up the last day of his execution who were sobbing uncontrollably. They loved him despite what he did. So when you experience that kind of thing and you're an empath like me, the idea of him being executed was so wrong. And I will tell you this in my book, that was one of the things I wanted to get across. It's easy to say, give him the lethal injection. I take him out and shoot him. I could do it myself. But when you get to know somebody, that's not really that easy to say that.
And in regards to that too, what makes you better than them? What makes you different than them, right? Being able to see a person as a person is ultimately what we should be striving towards, because in every single way, I see this daily. People just consistently degrade and dehumanize one another. And if we just were a little bit more compassionate and invited that humanity in, then I think there could be so many changes to this world. I love that you said that, and specifically the humanity, because I feel like that is a major motivation with this platform is I'm not excusing his behaviors. I'm not
No,
excusing their behaviors. But the more we look at them as monsters and we dehumanize them, the less that we can come to understand what motivates people or what pushes people to reach ultimately this breaking point. And that is the way that we can stop it from happening. If we keep calling them monsters, then people are going to continue to harm others.
take it another way. Gacy, I truly believe he wasn't born evil. I don't believe that. I believe he probably had all those things that I was talking about, and he had a couple head injuries. We could talk about that too.
Mm,
Which, if you look at the statistics on the number of people on death row who have had significant, I'm talking about hospitalization, head injuries, that could have affected his brain as well. But I, I do think that he, you have to understand it, and because you want to be able to, at some point in this world, be able to predict what someone's going to do and to try to cut it off. And when you see, for instance, school shooters, right? They are being dehumanized because they are shooting up schools and they're killing young people. And you have so much hatred and you have so much rage when you see these things happen. But look at all of these kids. They had some sort of trauma going on. They had some sort of fantasy going on about being bullied and they didn't know how to deal with it, and add to it a layer of parents give them a gun to use when they're making pictures of skulls in their classroom and threatening to kill people. And they hate the world so much that they're willing to just take people out and sometimes take themselves out with them. So if you think about it, let's figure out who the school shooters are. Let's figure out, are they past the point of no return or can they get help? And until we identify those people on an early age, we're going to have a lot more shootings, a lot more serial killing, a lot more evil acts.
yeah, we need to get intervention in there. And that's ultimately, I had this goal and this dream of becoming a forensic psychologist, getting my PsyD. And I had this unraveling when I was in the field during COVID with these families and these kids with significant complex trauma. And if you looked at their case files, anyone outside of us, and maybe even people within the organization would deem them as evil. I never saw evil, never once. I saw a lack of resources. I saw a lack of support, a lack of hope, a lack of trust. It was all just stripped from them. And ultimately, it whispered in my ear and was like, how are you going to determine competency under the law when you don't agree with what competency is under the law? Because it does not take into account tons of factors, let alone trauma is so misunderstood and left out. I ultimately had this huge unraveling that kind of spiraled over a time period of 8 months of what am I going to do? And by the time I get to meeting with these high profile cases, the harm has been done. People are already dead. People are already hurt, including the offender. They are already hurt. So, how can I really get to hopefully as far back as I can to really emphasize the fact that we need intervention in there ASAP? If you're noticing any sort of red flags, jump on them. Show kiddos support, show them compassion because you don't know what you could be looking at and you don't know the change that you could make.
Absolutely. And there are some exceptions to this, what I'm going to say. But if you look at people who commit these horrific acts, you are going to see that the parents there's maybe an absent father. Maybe the mother's very young. Maybe the mother has psychiatric problems and she's abusive. And then there's the outside abuse from others. And maybe someone who's been at 10 different schools in a few years and maybe gone through the foster system. And when you think you've had it hard growing up, I grew up in a blue collar family. I had food on the table. I had rules. I had clean sheets. I went to school. I had people who knew where I was at all times. And whatever I lacked when it came to money or money for college or all of that stuff. That's nothing compared to just basic needs, just basic safety and cleanliness and kindness and food. I y For every person who commits a crime, look at the family situation. Very few have normal families.
Mhm.
Very few.
Especially look at this day and age after COVID, the economy is being highlighted significantly and the challenges moving through this day to day. Now, imagine your situation. Imagine someone who doesn't have some of the privilege that you do have and you're struggling. So I think that's where we get so caught up in comparing ourselves to other people in the sense of, first of all, comparing yourself to people just sets off a standard, it sets a baseline. When people will say, I could have had it worse, I always say, but you also could have had it better, right? Let's explore the ways you could have had it better. Because when we stay back on this, I went through this, I could have had it worse, you're setting your boundary, you're setting your standard as that. Is that what you deserve? Or do you deserve something more? Let's set our boundary to that. But yeah, I think everything you just said is so important for us to really understand instead of comparing our situations and saying, I went through that and I didn't turn out like you. How can you understand the factors that might have played a key role?
And it might just be a slightly different upbringing. It sometimes just your, birth order. Maybe you were raised and maybe you were the youngest, and by the time you were being raised by your parents, the 2 oldest were out of the house, and maybe you got the brunt of some bad parenting. Sometimes 2 kids growing up when they're close together in age have each other to rely upon, and so if the parents are doing bad things, at least the 2 can bond together and take care of each other and be human beings together. So you can say, like, why did Gacy's 2 sisters they were raised in the same household and they became very productive, nice, kind people, and yet Gacy turned into what he turned into. It's a matter of his gender, it's a matter of his sexuality, it's a matter of his birth order, it's a matter of different things and how people respond. Some people are more sensitive to the woes that you have as a child, some are more resilient, some people aren't. we can't just have a blanket formula for people resulting in being normal or abnormal. It's case by case.
Totally. And I'm very interested, one, about his relationship with his family and you getting to know them, and two, about his head injuries. I think that's so important to discuss as well.
Yeah. So when Gacy was young, he had two very significant head injuries. And I know this because I talked at length to his sister, who just died a few weeks ago and was a very nice person, whose life, by the way, was completely destroyed by what happened. She had no idea that he was capable of it, was just in disbelief. She had to move out of town. She had to change her name. Her whole life was destroyed, but she didn't have the ability to be righteously grieving because she was a Gacy. In any event, she told me that there was one event where he got hit with a swing that was swinging, and it was so bad he went to the hospital and spent overnight. And there was another time where he was delivering groceries as one of his jobs for a local supermarket. It was the winter time, and he slid down a staircase and fell directly on his head. Again, he was hospitalized for his head injury, and as a result, after that head injury, he had, like, seizures that the doctor said was related to at least one of those head injuries, and those seizures continued for a number of years. So, again, we don't really know, but there are two parts of the brain, and you probably know this better than I do, that one part of the brain that affects your empathy can be damaged, and that, of course, is going to make it difficult to empathize with victims and to dehumanize them, which is what Gacy did. And then the other side of the brain that they say might be related to committing crimes is that impulse control part of the brain. So that if some people have those tendencies, they can control them, but somebody like Gacy maybe had that part damaged and therefore couldn't control those horrible impulses. Again, they examined his brain after his execution, and they found nothing that was out of the ordinary, but I don't know if that was maybe 30 years now later, maybe there are better ways to test that brain.
Of course, of course. And you want to look at it too, especially the frontal lobe is not even developed until we're 26 years old, which is where we see so many impulses, especially teenagers. People do not like teenagers. I love teenagers. I love them because just like criminals, I know that their baseline is a teenager's not going to tell me the full truth. A teenager is going to lie to me because it's part of them developing their identity too, is I have to discover my sense of self, but there are all these rules that are telling me that I can't be this type of way, and I'm having these thoughts, and those thoughts are bad, or I do want to go out to that party because I want to socialize, and that's what motivates me right now. So there's all this impact too. And again, we don't develop until we're 26. So that impulse control, especially, is processing. It's in development.
It's like your mother tells you when you're in your teens, if you do this is going to be the ramification. You don't care. You're not looking at tomorrow. You're looking at what you want, whether it's have some beer or have sex or go to a party that you shouldn't be going to or riding on a motorcycle or whatever it is that your parents are telling you not to do. You don't see the ramification of that. You don't say, hey, long term, that's not going to sit well with me. That's going to affect my ability to get into a good college. You're seeing a lot of that on social media where kids are doing things that are forever on the internet, and it's not a good, healthy thing to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, of course, from how you vocalize it and what you said, you became close with his sisters and his family. I'm interested in knowing about your relationship with them and really their perspectives and gaining a greater understanding around him.
Nobody in his family could believe this. Karen, her name is Karen, like me, sister that I became very close to, told me that John Gacy was a kind brother. He was generous. He helped elderly people. He never tortured animals. He was hardworking. He was funny, in which he was very funny. And he was kind to her family, generous. And she said, when he was arrested and I saw the news, I called him up and I said, John, did you do this? And he said, yes. And she told me, she looked at me and said, If he didn't say yes, I would never have believed, even all these years later, that he did it. I would have denied, even though those boys were buried under his house, she would have figured out another explanation because she did not believe it. She was shocked. Everybody in the family was shocked. All those years, can you imagine having to change your name, move out of town? Even now, she didn't want her grandchildren to know who she was and know who Gacy was because anyone associated with it could wreak their anger on her and the kids. And like I said before, the victim's family have a right to show their grief and their rage and their anger and their hatred. They have every right to do that. I don't begrudge them one iota. And I don't even begrudge them the hatred that they're lashing out at me, which some of them did because I was representing the evil person who took their loved one. I get that. I do.
Totally.
But Karen didn't have the right to stand out and say, not only was my life ruined by the fact that my brother was evil and did these evil things, I feel guilt because maybe I could have done something. Should I have realized this? Should I have helped him? Should I have intervened? Like, how would I have known? And she can't stand up and say those things because she doesn't have the right to do it. In fact, she wanted to stay as far away from the whole media circus as possible because she had a family to raise and didn't want them to be threatened physically. And then when he was executed, there was another layer of grief because the government executed her brother. It's a whole other level that we're talking about here.
Compassion on all ends, understanding that in some way, shape, or form, she is also experiencing a major loss. It's a loss.
It is. It is a loss. A human loss is a loss. And if you're a human being, if you're truly human, right? You got all those good things, that empathy and sympathy, and you don't want someone to die. Even your enemies, you might say, oh gosh, I wish he dropped dead. But you don't. And especially if you can control it, especially if you have something to say about it, it is not human to want somebody dead. And the part of Gacy that wanted people dead was not human. Gacy was human, but not that part of him. And I could never be that part of Gacy where I could say, kill him, execute him. I have a quick story. I taught the death penalty at University of Illinois Law School. And I had kids in my class for years. I probably had, 300 kids over the years. And part of my class was I would hook them up with a death row lawyer. And the kids could do whatever they wanted. They could visit the inmate. They could correspond with him. They could do legal research for him. And at the beginning of the class, I asked how many people are in favor, how many opposed. So we had a good number of people who were in favor of it. At the end of the class, when I asked each and every classmate who corresponded with or did something for the inmate, now what do you think about your inmate? Should that person live or die? 100% of them said that person should live. I don't care that he did an evil crime. I don't care that he's not particularly nice. I don't care that he's really guilty when there's no question about it. This guy should live. And why is that? Because when you get to know somebody and you get to see their humanity, even if it's just a little bit of humanity, you don't want them dead. It's not human. Just not.
Nope. We're punishing them for doing ultimately what we're doing to them. And that's the thing too, is we have a whole new generation of people that are calling out this hypocrisy, right? Of the government being like, it's a death penalty because they killed people. And now these generations are saying, and you were saying, but especially with the influx of generations underneath me, they're saying, wait, if they're being locked away for killing someone, then why are we going to punish them by doing the same thing? How does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I recount in my book that when I was like 7 or 8 or something, I was having this argument with my father, and my father had the radio on. Oh, someone's going to be executed. And I said, Dad, that's just not right. Why would you kill someone for killing someone? It'd be like if I had a messy room and Mom came in and tried to punish me by messing up my room. That doesn't make sense, does it? So, of course, a lawyer was born at that age. But it is falling out of favor, I think, is what you're getting to. And I do believe that even in these school shooting cases, you're seeing jurors. First of all, you're seeing prosecutors not seeking it as much, seeing jurors not buying it. There have been a couple big, high profile shooting cases where the jury just opted not to give the death penalty. A lot of people believe that it's more of a punishment to put someone in prison for the rest of their lives and that they don't want the blood on their hands. They just can't fathom it. Easy to say, kill them until you're on that jury and you have to put someone into the electric chair. And I think that you're seeing this is the lowest approval rate for the death penalty in probably 200 years. And a lot of states are abolishing it. Illinois abolished it in 2011. The federal government really doesn't go for the death penalty under this administration. And I think that this next generation does not have the stomach for it. I think they're going to refuse to elect people who want the death penalty. And I think it's going to fall out of favor. And then we're going to finally be consistent with the rest of the civilized world who does not have the death penalty. We're one of 4 developed nations who still have the death penalty.
But then I say this to people all the time. We can't push people into a survival state and not expect to see survival behaviors. It's also like the deterrence factor with the death penalty. You can argue for that. It doesn't deter anything because deterrence also correlates with immediate gratification, which is part of that impulse control, right? But we see this need for immediate gratification everywhere. And it just doesn't work because the death penalty takes how long? So
Yeah, and you know what? I will say there is no argument that the death penalty is a deterrent. Even the people who are pro capital punishment, you find me one study that shows that. In fact, the places where they have more murders are the places like Texas and Florida where they have more death penalty cases and more people being executed. And nobody says, not only I'm not going to commit murder because there's a death penalty. It's not even that comparison. Comparison is if I commit murder, I'm going to get death versus life. And I really think that death is worse than life. People don't assess that. People don't think they're going to get caught. People do things on the spur of the moment. If it deterred, I might even consider being on board. If I could save lives by executing somebody, maybe I would think about it. But it just doesn't deter. And no one can argue it. They just can't.
because it's a punishment. And when we're talking about these high profile cases, they've experienced such significant trauma. Trauma work requires relationships. Trauma work is relational. Their whole life has been a consequence. They've been punished and punished time and time again through this abuse and in turn how it manifests. They don't care about consequences. You don't care when you're in a survival state. But when you build a relationship with someone like you were building a relationship with such a high profile case, regardless of what type of relationship it was, because you went in there willing to be relational, you were able to see a human being on the other side.
That's absolutely true. And I will tell you that I was Gacy's only female attorney in all 14 years he was on death row. And as such, and I will say I was probably the most empathetic one out of all the lawyers because I was curious and I wanted to connect with him. I wanted to understand him. It was important for me. I knew he had 7 months left to live, and I wanted to connect with this human being to understand something about him that could make me really appreciate the origins, the reasons. And not to say that I figured anything out, because I didn't. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a psychologist. But I do think that I approached it differently. And I tried to get to that human side. I tried to understand what made him tick. What made you happy when you were a kid? What made you sad? Did you hate your father? Did you love your father? Why didn't your mother step in and help you? Were you mad at your mother because of that? And he liked women. So he was a little more open to me. He wasn't as oppositional. He wasn't as defensive. He opened up and he allowed me in just a little bit. And I think I saw a different side of him as his only female attorney.
Mhm, mhm. And I think I do wanna highlight the fact that you said you're a lawyer, not a psychologist, and you have made such big moves and great changes just from even having this conversation and just from you highlighting the areas that you highlight because we need more people to work under the law, work with the law, to work with any sort of case, to have a little bit of empathy and to approach cases like you, to get curious, to get to know the other side. Uh, the law tends to look at things, and we're seeing a major shift, which is why things are falling because there's a ton of gray. There's so much gray. It's not black and white. We're people. We're so nuanced. We're so complex. And you take that into your work.
And I think that everybody should know about psychology. And
Mhm.
though I really practice now in the family law realm, I get such a benefit because I know what a borderline personality is. I know what a narcissist is. I know the different types of narcissists, and I know what they'll do. And I know how they lash out. And I know how they try to latch on to children and try to get custody just to hurt the other party. And I know that they're impossible to deal with, and most narcissists end up getting divorced because they can't stay married for good reason. So when you know about these different personality disorders, as weird as they might seem, they're weird in the same way over and over again. And if you know how to manipulate them back, if you know how to get to the bottom of it or get them to stop doing what they're doing, you can resolve people's problems in a so much more efficient and kind way. So again, understanding people's motivation, not just a one trick pony kind of thing where you just do the same thing every time. You understand who's coming at it. Even if I'm dealing with a non personality disordered person, I want to know what your background is. I want to know, did he cheat? Are you upset? Are you emotionally distraught? Are you over that? Are you punishing him for doing that? Are you ready to move on? What's your goal in the future? What was your upbringing like? I like to know that because I want to help that person move to make the right decisions, to get what they want and to get what they need and move on. More importantly than anything is to just be able to move on and get behind you all your legal problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that too is what we're seeing right now is such a rise and escalation and people using the term narcissism and it drives me mad because part of specializing, I say it as an umbrella term, part of specializing in complex trauma and systemic trauma is ultimately part of that branch is personality disorders. And that's because a personality disorder is one of the only recognized disorders and diagnoses in the DSM, which the DSM has many flaws and is not up to date. However, I do love this. They are one of the only areas that recognize personality disorders stem from unresolved trauma. And so right now we're seeing such a rise, and I'm doing like a theory kind of before we were seeing a rise in people using the word borderline. Borderline, they're borderline. That's all I heard. That's all I would see. It felt like it was just plaguing everything. And now it's switched to narcissism. There's a major rise in the feminine right now, right? There's a major rise in understanding the female power, the feminine archetype. Borderline is attributed more to women. Narcissism is attributed more to men. So I think it's super interesting. However, it's really problematic in the sense that so many people are just throwing out this word narcissism, but aren't utilizing it in a way to be effective and come up with solutions and say, I understand how this person is going to tick. So this is how I need to move. And this is what I need to do to maintain safety and make sure all goals are being met.
Absolutely. And I suppose there's narcissism and then there's narcissistic tendencies or narcissistic action. Uh,
Yes.
so even if you can't perfectly diagnose it, because I certainly can't, you can see the trends and you can see the behaviors and the speech patterns. If I can't have that, you're not going to have it kind of thing. And then playing the victim, which is a
Bingo.
big thing that the narcissistic, uh, tendencies will show. You're always the one on the receiving end of it. You're making yourself to be a victim, and it's all very interesting. But again, when we're not talking about the violent people, because not all narcissists or borderlines are violent, but there's that weird combination of sex and death and the personality disorders that turns into the perfect storm.
Yeah, perfect storm. Really? Wow. Is there anything that you feel like you want to share that you haven't shared yet?
I'm really interested in having your listeners read my book because if you're interested in serial killers, there's some of that. Definitely. It's about Gacy. No one wants to read a book about Karen Conti. But my book goes beyond that. My book goes beyond, and I wrote it just like lava flowing out. Looking back in my career, looking back as female, how I was treated differently, looking back on how I took something and I was curious. I was so curious, I had to go visit him, but it turned into me taking on this major responsibility that was pivotal in my life and that changed my life completely. I became a media analyst 30 days after Gacy was executed. O.J. Simpson happened. And so I became a legal analyst. I got a radio show. I've had radio shows on WGN in Chicago for 30 years. I became a law professor because the law professor from my law school wanted me to teach the death penalty. And so all of these good things happened in my career, but also happened to me personally because I was stronger. I was more resilient. I learned to have very thick skin. And I basically stopped worrying about what every last person thought about me, which as a young woman, I did way too much of. And I think that could send a message, not just for women, but for young people to just do the thing that you think is right, stick to your guns, and deal with the ramifications. And when you do something, learn to do it, get prepared, and do it well and do it with dignity. And that's all you can do in life, right?
Oh, I have so many goosebumps. I know I'm going to be ordering your book. And I know that my followers and my listeners too understand that this platform is not for really shaming anyone, right? It's not made to just discuss just the person and their crimes. It's to get to know the fuller picture. And that's what it sounds like your book does is get to know the full picture, get to know you, see your wins, see the way it impacted you. I actually just heard it earlier. Someone was like, "Curiosity killed the cat." And I always argue with that. And I'm like, "No, it didn't." Did it? Because my cats are so curious. And we encourage it. And what do? They learn. Our cats are so attuned because we encourage curiosity. Encourage the curiosity. Check that out. How can you do it safely? But curiosity allows us to expand. It allows us to grow.
I just gave a speech to some people and I focused on that in my part of the book. And as we get older, it starts to ebb because you want to protect yourself. I don't have time to read that article. I don't have time to go to that class. I don't have time to change my ways or make a new friend because I just want to stay protective of who I am. And as we get older, we tend to do that, right? We hold the railing going down now. Whereas before we're young, we fly down and we don't care. But you have to maintain that curiosity. And it's always been good for me. I always say, if you're reading a newspaper or online, read an article that you don't care about. Read about Switzerland. When you don't care about Switzerland, read about it. Visit a place besides Las Vegas or Disney World. Go somewhere new. Go somewhere you may not think you have an interest in, and you'll change and you'll open up your world to different things, and it's all good. And then you have a better understanding of people. And it's easy to hate people in different states. It's easy to hate people in different countries. But when you go there, I went to Vietnam, for instance, and it's like people are like, why would you go there? It's such a horrible country, and they had so much. So we were at war with. I got to understand what kind people they are, and despite their poverty and what we did in that war, they loved us and they were kind to us, and they showed humanity to all of us as tourists. And I was like, that changes your world. And so curiosity, I say, put that on top of your list.
I love it. And look what it did for me. I stumbled upon you. I was just doing my research. I have a big, huge post-it notepad. And I'm like, something's not sitting right with me. And just typed in Google, John Wayne Gacy. And you popped right up
Well, that's
because
funny.
recently your book, and I said, okay, what can I do with this? And I said, I can get a little curious. I can have fun. Because if she doesn't respond or if it's a no, that's all. That's it. So be it. But the best case scenario is she responds and it's a yes and it opens this door.
Here we
Yeah, here
are.
we are. Thank you so much. In addition to your book, could you repeat the title of your book? Just
Sure.
in case. Yeah.
It's called Killing Time with John Wayne Gacy, Defending America's Most Evil Serial Killer on Death Row. You can get it on Amazon or Walmart or Book the Million. And my website is KarenConti.com, KarenConti. And I love when people email me after they read the book because I love hearing from people. I learned this, or I liked it because of this, or I hated it because of that, or you got too preachy, or I like hearing the feedback because I'm not writing a book to make money. I'm writing a book because I think I have a message and I think it could help people. And I love to hear one way or the other. So I encourage your listeners to get my book, read it, react to it. If you like it on Amazon, give me a good review. That helps me. If you don't like it, tell them you just read a John Grisham novel. Oh, sorry. John, I didn't mean that. Sorry. Just joking.
I love that. Thank you so much. This has been so enjoyable. And I know it's really beneficial for me to gain this greater awareness. So I just can't thank you enough.
Thank you for having me on, Corrine. It was really nice to connect.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, share the love with your friends, with your neighbors, with your coworkers, with your community, and head on over to my social media or my website. I'll leave the links in my bio and let's just share. This is really about connecting and sharing awareness because that's what intimacy is at its highest level of consciousness. Thank you so much, and we'll chat soon.